when we discuss the halachas of ksamim, so the assumption that we start out with is l'chayra, that ksamim are aser, they're tameh, unless you're able to prove, you have a means of demonstrating that it's indeed not dam nida according to the framework, the parameters of halacha. But if you go through Siman Kuf Tzaddik, we seemingly find a tantalizing possibility, which is that in fact the halachic reality is the complete opposite. We'll start with a tour here in Siman Kuf Tzaddik, the passage that's marked Sif Lamed Aleph, because it's Shaykh to Sif Lamed Aleph. The Torah says, Kosev HaRashba, and it's a quote from the Rashba, Teres Abayas HaKotzer, Yesh Misha Hayra, there's someone who said, She'ein Isha Chesheshas Mishum Kasem, Ad Sheteda Bebirur Shehu Dam, that a woman is not Cheshesh to a Kasem unless she knows for sure that it is blood. This language, Eina Chesheshas Ad, sounds like every woman is tahar until proven otherwise. So, Ketzad Yoysa, what should she do? Taver olav shiva samanin. So you run it through these 7 ingredients. Avar harez adam. If it managed to remove the stain, that proves that it is blood, and she's tameh. Vim amad, and if the stain remains, harez tseva, then it must be some other paint, some other color. Ve'ena chesheshes loy, and now she's not cheshesh. So we also see here that, according to this system, blood leaves more easily than other colors. And now that Rashba, after having concluded this quote of Yesh Mi Shahira, he then responds and he says, Ve'ein roi lismech al zeh. We should not rely on this. Ela chesheshes loy min hastam. By default, she should be cheshesh. Meaning, he's responding to this, what's the default here? You said, Eino chesheshes ad sheted bebir. No. Chesheshes min hastam. But Rashba says, I agree that hever olav sheva samanim v'loy avar vade tahiri. But if you did the test and you couldn't get it out, then it still works. She is tahira. She'ein lachadam she'ein oivra yedei sheva samanim. There's no blood that would not leave in this manner, but it has to be done properly. You have to do it in the correct order. Ad kan. Right. So he just disagreed with the part about ein chesheshas, but he agrees that the test works. Now the Torah brings an entirely different opinion. The Ramban wrote that we do not rely on Bedika Samanin to say that it's a tzeva and thereby be matir her to her husband. Shleihuskru Bedika Samanin el latayris. It's a whole different Indian, referring to objects being tamei or tahar, but nothing to do with whether a woman is mutter to her husband or not. So, Chashinon Shema Damhu. Even if it didn't leave, even if you ran the Shivas Amanim, Okay. Yeah, I'm talking about being Matami objects, not the issues. Yeah. So even if you did the test and it didn't come out, Chashin and Shem Adamhu Vasur Labayla were still Chashish. So according to the Ramban, there is no such concept at all. Benegeya, issues, Isur Nida. Look in the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef first begins by quoting the Rashba Ha'aruch, the Teres Abayas Ha'aruch. There, it turns out that the Yesh Mi Shahira is none other than the Rambam, seemingly. It sounds like the Rambam Taka holds that she's mamish not choshesh until she tests. And in the Teres Abayas Ha'aruch as well, the Rashba says his opinion that he's willing to accept the test, the results of the test, if you want to do that. He says, why should it only work for Titus and not should be kol shekain? But again, if you're going to use the language eina chesheshas, it has to mean maybe only the Titus. Maybe the Rambam only meant eina chesheshas la Titus, but not for her husband. Or maybe even more. Look in the Mishnah, the Rashba says. The Lashon in the Mishnah, where this whole didn't started, is Shiva Saman and Mavidin ala Kesem. Doesn't this language of Eina Chesheshas, Eina Asur, doesn't say that in the Mishnah. It says Shiva Saman and Mavidin ala Kesem. Sounds pretty clear that it's Tamei until you're Mavir as a Kesem, then we can talk. So both for Taharis, in that case, both for Taharis and both for Baila, surely she's Tmeya Misafik until the Bedika. After quoting the Rashba, Teres Abayas Aruch, the Beis Yosef quotes the Rambam directly in Yisurei Bia, Perek Tes, and the Lashon there, the exact Lashon of the Rambam is Einoi Metame Ad Sheyivoda Shehu Dam. And Beis Yosef quotes the Maggid Mishnah, who's from the same school as the Rashba, but he's commenting directly on the Rambam. The Maggid Mishnah wants to argue that the Rambam never meant to say that a woman herself is not tamei until she does this bedika. He says, if she doesn't do this test, vaday tamei misafik. Why? She'ein ze safik shel devreim dehochen boi lahakol. This isn't the regular safik to Rabbanan that we should be makel. Sharei kvar on yochaylim lamed ali kare shel davar bebedika. Because we have a test. Dafka, because we have a test that works. That is precisely the reason why we can't just be makel misafik. Two things don't go together. You tell me there's a test, that means you have to be machmer until you do the test. And he continues, the Rambam wrote, Einem etame. What the Rambam meant was, Einem etame tumavadois, shaloi yehela bedika. Tumavadois means there is nothing you can do about it. Einem etame bevados, until she does the bedika. Once she does the bedika, then we'll decide whether she's tamei bevada or not. Otherwise, if the Rambam really meant that she's tahira, it should have said, Nistapik lahem shu dam oitzeva adam tahira. It's not the language of the Rambam. Okay, the Rambam is a bit unclear, but that's what the Maggid Mishnah wants to argue. So the Beis Yosef says, according to the Maggid Mishnah, or maybe the Maggid Mishnah himself says, that Bazai, the Rambam and the Rashba actually agree fully. Doesn't work, you can't just be matar without a test, but if you run the test, then the test can be matar. It's just that the Rashba himself understood the Rambam differently. And in fact, if you look in the Dovid on the Rambam, the Dovid also, from his comments on the Rambam, he seems to understand the Rambam that way, and he's saying fakert. And in fact, the Dovid goes all the way to he holds like the Ramban. He holds that there is no such musag at all. Legabe ish, it's only for taris. So the Beis Yosef says that he prefers the Maggid Mishnah's understanding. He says, that's a much better pshat. No one disagrees, surely, for the bottom line. If we're not sure, surely she's tamei until proven otherwise. I'll feel whether or not you did a test. Of course, she's tamei misafek. Both the Rambam and the Rashba agree, and everyone really agrees. The Ramban, the Dovid, everyone agrees to that. The only machlekes now will be whether the test is acceptable. According to the Ramban, and presumably also the Dovid, Tmei Labaila, La Rambam, La Rashba, Rav Maggid Mishnah, Tohera. Okay, so at this point, we've basically abandoned the idea, the concept that maybe a woman is B'chlal Tahar until we do a test. But now we have a new possibility. Can we do this test? Is it possible that without an outright tzliya, without an outright proof from external circumstances, it seems like it's possible to run some kind of physical test, and then we can prove whether this is dam or not. But then the Beis Yosef adds and concludes adds a final paragraph and concludes, he says, B'chlal, the details about this are in the Gemara and in the Rambam. There are many more details there, even in the Rambam, that the Torah didn't even bother to mention. And the Beis Yosef concludes, we don't know what some of them are. For us, for our purposes, nofal inyan avoyos shiva samamanim bebira. So that's the lashon, the expression. It fell into a pit. It's gone. We don't have this concept anymore. And even though it sounds like a little bit like the Beis Yosef is the one who's being mechadish this, he just came up with this idea now. But we could probably assume the opposite. That until we find mekaydes from Rishonim that describe actually using this lemaisa, it's very possible that all the discussions up until then were just theoretical. Especially when you see like the Torah is not even citing the specific details. And it seems more like the Beis Yosef finally came along and quote-unquote updated the halacha to reflect the fact that, hey, we're no longer actually, no one's doing this. And based on all of this, now when you come to Shulchan Aruch, you can see how the Beis Yosef, how the Mechaber essentially rewrote the halacha in Sif Lamed Aleph. This is the way it says it now in Sif Lamed Aleph. Matzah kesem. She doesn't have a regular tliyah. We're still not sure, is it blood or some other color? So he makes it very clear, first of all, that if you don't do the test, of course she's tamei misafek, so it leaves no doubt on that. And then the Mechaber adds, "V'achshav ein lanu havara zayin samanu mepnei she'einonu b'kiyam b'ktsas mishmaisam." So he took this line, his own lashon, and rewrote it and put it into the Shulchan Aruch that we don't have it anymore. If you look in the Sif and Shulchan Aruch, you notice that the major Nesa Kalim don't even bother commenting. They have nothing to say, to add. But there are some interesting discussions in some of the Achrein and some of the other Nesa Kalim. So, for example, in the Minchas Yaakov / Teiras HaShlomim on the Daf at Shulchan Aruch, he has two comments on the main point that she's Tmeya Misafik. So he says, quotes the Maggid Mishnah in the Suri Bia, who says that even the Rambam really agrees, according to the Maggid Mishnah's interpretation, even the Rambam agrees you have to be Machmer Misafik. And the Maggid Mishnah uses this line, because we're able to be Mevarer, therefore it's not really a Safik. You can't treat it like a Safik D'Rabbanan. So the Teiras HaShlomim adds, Mashma, the Heichi Di'i Efsher Bibedika, if for some reason you can't test, then Kuli Alma Meida, to have a Safik D'Rabbanan L'Kula, then maybe everyone would agree that it is a Safik D'Rabbanan L'Kula. The whole issue is that you're able to test it. Then Rash and Arayva, they all agree. They would all agree to this statement that if there's no possibility of testing, maybe it could be more mekel. With the Lake Bach, the Bach tried to turn that into the machlekes itself between the Rambam and the other Rishonim, that according to the Rambam, where you can't test, she's tahira, and they hold. He says you don't have to go in that direction at all. Everyone agrees that without the possibility of testing, it should be Safek D'Rabbanan L'Kula. And then he's mitzayin to Kunchus HaSveikus, because this essentially goes into some more broader territory. You have Klolim and Gdarim and Sveikus, Safek D'Rabbanan. So this is there is a broader sugya here. And then when the Chaber adds, the Teiras HaShlomim says, hey, we just said in Sifkat and Chavtes that if you don't have the possibility of a bedika, that should make things more kuladik. I can't test, I can't prove. The Mechaber just said we don't have a bedika anymore. So if we have a suffix in the future, if we would sevo edam, now we should be able to be mekel. The lack of a test made things easier, not harder. He says, however, the Lavush writes, the Eish lahachmer misafik. If you look in the Lavush, you see how the Lavush sort of combines. He starts off by saying, Einonu b'kiyim, and he ends off, she's tmeya because afshar levarer. He somehow puts the two things together. So he's the first one to acknowledge, but ends up with the same askana. So Teiras HaShlomim says, Tzarech leimar dahave kesafik chisaron yediyah. We say in Sveikus that if the whole basis of the suffix is just your lack of knowledge, your lack of information, lav dafka, we consider that a suffix. So the fact that you're not sure if it's Damar Tzeva, and you're not sure how to test it, that's your problem. That doesn't change, that doesn't turn it into a suffix D'Rabbanan L'Kula. That itself is also, could be its own discussion. And he's mitzayin to Kunchus HaSveikus. If you look in Sif Mem Vav and the Shach and Taz, in a different context, they also mention this Yisoid, B'chlal. Look in the Shach there, L'mashal. The Shach says, She'ein zeh kesafek D'Rabbanan, the safek haba mimiyot hakara ein a safek. If the safek is just your lack of knowledge, not a safek. Dim ein zeh baki umakir. If you don't know, acher yakir, there's someone else out there who knows. So that's not a good basis for changing the halach. Look in the Alter Rebbe here, you'll see the Alter Rebbe essentially copies and rewrites the Teichen of the Teiras HaShlomim in Sifkat and Zayin on Tmeya Misafik. The Alter Rebbe says, She'ein zeh safek shel devreim shel hochem be'lahakol shari kavaron yochayna lamed al ikari shel Dovid b'bedika minchas Yaakov. And then on the Mechaber saying we don't know the names, so Alter Rebbe immediately says, V'havalei kesafek haba mechisaron yediyah the loy mikri safek. He takes the language from the Shach and Sif Mem Vav and brings it here. We can't turn this into a suffix. Someone out there knows what the Zayin Samanim are, so that's not a Yisod for anything. Now, that itself, as Lomdus, can be its own share, its own discussion, but I want to go in a different direction, which is, does this leave any possibility in the generations that follow for there to be some kind of other test that maybe we could rely on? Once upon a time, there may have been by using spit, and today, of course, with all kinds of developments in science, there might be all kinds of lab tests that we might be able to run. And would that have an effect on Hilchas Nida. Maybe instead of paskening, maybe we should start using a laboratory. We should switch completely over. But what role, if any, does this have to play in these halachas? Seemingly, none of the Makaidos we discussed until now got into that. But if you look in the Be'er HaGoyla, the Tziyunim on Shulchan Aruch, most of the time he sticks to Tziyunim, but sometimes he adds his own ideas. So in the end of the Siman, the end of the Be'er HaGoyla, there's a bit of a Hagah. And the Be'er HaGoyla writes, Kasuv b'Sefer Shalah, b'Shem Shiltei Gibayrim. In the Shalah, there are sections where he goes through Yonei Halacha. So the Shalah quotes from the Shiltei Gibayrim, Simonei Ksamim. Simanim that you can use for Ksamim. Ktsasam, some of them, he starts listing. K'sherdochika ala kesem. If she spits on the stain, chalaf v'halach le miyad, and it immediately comes off, zeo siman tara. And then he mentions another detail, which is a different type of siman. And after the second detail, he writes, v'tzorech iyan b'zeh. Note, at this point, we're already speaking of a different type of test versus the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, the blood comes off after a lot of samanin. The tzeva always remains. Here we're talking about the opposite. We're talking about a tzeva that comes off like this with spit. Not quite the same gather. It's the other side. If you look in the marker, the Shiltei Gibayrim is printed, the Rif, look at the end of Shavuos. So that's where the Rif gets into Nida, and that's where the Shiltei Gibayrim, who's on the Rif, gets into Nida. So he talks, it's the context is, there was a specific question. Isha asher tavla, v'shnei yamim acher tevilasa, 2 days after toveling, she found a stain on her dress, and she wasn't sure, she had a question about this, because she has a vesis kavua, number one, so this is very out of character. Also, she has hargasha, usually. There's no hargasha here. I don't know if it's hargasha mamish or more like a vesis aguf. She feels it coming. At this time, she felt nothing. She also had a theory. Her theory was that there are birds, and the shmutz that the birds make is actually rather similar in appearance to a kesem. And this is a common problem. This is a problem doesn't even describe it as a problem. It's just part of life. Yeah, this clothing and the bird droppings are on it all the time. They put it out to dry, this bird droppings, leave it in her room. The birds come into the room. They're all over the place. So it seems very reasonable to say that maybe there's a connection, there's something to do. Then he adds, Gam, k'shiraka ala kasem, chalaf v'halach le miyad. That's the original quote. So he writes, Nira be'enai, the ha'isha azois muteres labayla, and gets into the details, and he adds, V'ulam, hasimon and hamasurim b'yad hanoshim livdik haksamim, the simon the women have, umatsu. That this bedika, based on this, it's not from the enam min haksamim ha'asurim, al zeh vaday yesh lismech lahater. So that's the makar, the Shiltei Gibayrim, that the Shalah quotes in the Shalah, and then in turn the Be'er HaGoyla quotes in the name of the Shalah, name of the Shiltei Gibayrim. If you look in the Piskei Dinim, here in the Tzemach Tzedek, and as we know, all the Piskei Dinim that are in this format of Seifim are not, in fact, from the Tzemach Tzedek. They're from one of the Chasidim, Chasidish Rabbanim. But the fact that they were printed in the Tzemach Tzedek gives them a certain chashivas, hashkacha pratas. So he writes, V'yesh mi she'omer she'yesh simonim mesurim b'yad hanoshim livdik haksamim imahim tmei yamay tahirim. There's some who say this. And shekol kasem ha'over, for example, shekol kasem ha'over miyad ha'yidei kika sherechikan alav, by spitting taharu Shiltei Gibayrim v'hoida lo'ha be'er HaGoyla. He says the Be'er HaGoyla was maida. In other words, the way he read the Be'er HaGoyla quoted the kika, and then he quoted another thing, and he wrote the tzorech iyan b'zeh. The way the Piskei Dinim in the Tzemach Tzedek understood it was that the tzorech iyan b'zeh is only in reference to the second thing. That must mean that the Be'er HaGoyla was maskim hoida lo'ha and the first thing under the kika. Others disagree if that's how you should read the Be'er HaGoyla, but that's his reading. V'yesh mefakbikin gam b'zeh emroi lahakil me'acha she'en lanu kabbalah v'hira berura me'chazal al zeh ech yerav libeinu lahakil v'lismech al zeh shut dvar shmuel siman reish chavav. You can see in the kaivetz from the other Kolel, there's a younger man a few years ago who actually went through siman kuf tzadik and the Piskei Dinim and printed it up very nicely, fixed all the mistakes, ha'aris, bar mekaymis. So what's the shut dvar shmuel? Shut Dvar Shmuel is Shmuel Abohav of Venice. We mentioned it in the Shiur on Gris, that he was one of the first to discuss it. The Sefer was printed in 1702. So there's a tshuva there to Rav Mordechai Basan of Verona on this issue. What do we do with this Shiltei Giborim cited in the Shalah about the spitting? What's up with that? Is that something we rely on? So the Dvar Shmuel says, Divrei Harav HaNizker Einu Muvanim Atzli. I don't understand it. He says, I know the Shalah, he brings the Shiltei Giborim, but Lo Yomer Boi Lo Isser V'Lo Heter. I don't know if the Shalah actually agreed. Can we say the Shalah signed on? Or he just quoted it. That's his argument. He says, I'm very concerned to be makel like this, and all the ksamim that are actually red or black, where there's no actual tliya and amaka or other things that are mentioned in Gemara and Paiskim without any Kabbalah or Hera, Brura Mechazal. And if we start being makel on our own in ksamim d'Rabbanan to rely on the women with some kind of bedika or rubbing with spit, they might come to be matir, chas v'shalom, similarly with Riyas Dam D'Oraisa. And we find that the Zayin Samamonim, Mishnah, that is in the Mishnah, Umina Kabbalah, and the first one on the list is in fact spit. Spit is actually one of the Zayin Samamonim. And we find, he says, Harambam, it's clearly, should say the Ramban and others are machmir, that has nothing to do with Matar Isha Labayla, it's only for Taris. So how can we now just rely and be makel on Dvarim Bilti Muvanim? Where did this come from? Shalnimtza Pirusham, Ben Sifri Paiskam Achrein, and that's what I think that Dvar Shmuel says. So that's what the Piskei Dinim and the Tzemach Tzedek is quoting as a counter argument. You look also on the Daf, the quote from the Birkei Yosef, the Shiur de Bracha, the Chidah. Kol shekein she'ein lismich al hanashim b'shum bedika. Don't rely on these women and their tests. B'ksamim, bedika b'ksamim, or b'shifshif v'roik. K'shedekekas al hakasem b'chalav halachloi. V'oim neshazeu simen she'en hakasem. Don't rely on them, like the Dvar Shmuel said. Udulei karav Shiltei Giborim. He says he copied this from someone else's Hagoyis, but he included it. You have other Achrayim like this as well. If you look in the Darkei Tshuva here, a little bit more Barichas, he starts by quoting the Sidrei Tara. The Sidrei Tara says, if you look at the Shiltei Giborim, there was a whole story there about the birds and the droppings. He says, based on all the other information, it made a lot of sense to be matir in that case, because there was all the rest. Kivan de'ikil mitli, b'vadei talina m'chodar, that's a tzliya. You actually have an explanation. And he says that's why the Sidrei Tara in this Seif starts listing. He says nowadays that we know that there are other sources, potential sources of stains on women. He says, for example, in his day, the women were very into the tobacco. They were also smelling the snuff. So there's a lot of tobacco. The tobacco falls on the clothing, creates a reddish, brownish stain. So he says, absolutely, that would be something to keep in mind if you're looking at the kasem. He says also sometimes women wear some kind of red socks, stockings, and when she sweats, it starts leaking. I guess, whatever the dye in the sock is not very strong. And then it can create stains. So you also have to keep that in mind. That's also a possibility here. So the Sidrei Tara says there's a lot more there in that story than just the spitting. And then the Darkei Tshuva says, look in the Beir HaGayla, the Shalosh, the Gibayim, the Tzarech. The Sidrei Tara says, what's the Tzarech in the Beir HaGayla on? Is it on both? Is it just on the second one? He quotes it Tzemach Tzedek Psakim, La'agoy in HaKadosh, Rebbe of Lubavitch. Also, that the suffix was only on the first one, on the second one, not on the first one. Tzarech. Okay, Einei Mukhrach. Maybe the Tzarech of the Beir HaGayla was on both. Fine. Then he quotes another tshuva, a related tshuva, from Shut Zera Emes. Chelik Beis Siman Pei Beis. Zera Emes was Rabbi Shmuel HaKayin. He was a Rav in Italy in the later years. This sefer was printed in 1823. He was asked about a different type of test that just by running a finger over the stain, the stain seemed to disappear. Does that work? And weiter, this Rabbi Shmuel HaKayin, Zera Emes, he was very unhappy, and he essentially repeats many of the arguments of the Dvar Shmuel, and he says that in this case, we can't just be toilet, we can't just rely on this. All we have is what Chacham said, and even that we're not bucky, so where does this come from? And then the Darkei Tshuva points out another thing, that there's in Shura Shoy, there's someone who had a chap, that if you look in Sif Mem Vav, talks about another woman washed the clothing. Do we assume the stain was there from before? Do we not? Back and forth. But one of the nekudas that comes up in that discussion is that it seems like if they were washing it and there was a kasem of a dam nida, then the woman would make sure to wash it until it gets removed. Mashenken, if there's other stains, those stains might not come out. So someone said, hey, based on that that should be the test. We should make a test. Let's put it in the wash. Obviously not a washing machine, but whatever they washed it. And let's see if it comes out or not. Similar to the original idea. And the Shura Shoy said, no, you completely misunderstood. That's not the vart at all. It's only lahachmer, not lahakal. But those also point out that there's a tshuva of the Chassam Sofer. In Yeridei Siman Kuf Peiches, a shayla about a woman, she found a kesem. Who did she show the kesem to? She showed the kesem to her shviger. And the shviger said, Tameh. Okay? The shviger kapaskant. Then she went and she found another woman, a better friend. The Chassam Sofer calls her, or the person who asked it, they call her a marshas, this evil woman. She went to her, and the woman said, oh, no, you don't know. There's the spit test. Just put the spit on it, and you'll see if it comes out, it's fine. So the Masha said, so she listened, and she went ahead, and V'shim Shem Baila, halacha l'maisa. There were no Rabbanim apparently in the process. And then when the shviger found out about it, plus everything gets back to the shviger started screaming, Tzavcha kekruchia, what did you do? What's going on here? And part of the shaila, which I guess was more common amol, is what's the Kabbalah's tshuva? What kind of tshuva do they have to do? Amol, that was considered a big part of these types of shailas. So he says, but the kapara, he says, first of all, he establishes they both need a kapara. At the end of Siman Kuf Pei Hey, when it talks about Pirsa Nida, and the guy was Pirish instead of waiting, there's this vart there that only he's tzarach kapara and not she, because she's just a passive participant. Says that's dafka over there by Prisha. Here, obviously, in this case, it's a whole different situation. She had the kasem, etc., etc. She's very proactive here. No comparison. And he says, and when it comes to the tshuva, if anything, I would be machmir. Then in Siman Kuf Pei Hey, because now they're mamish krevim lemezid. On the other hand, despite the fact that they're taka krevim lemezid and they deserve to be screamed at, and mikol shekain hamesis v'hamidiach hamarshas, this evil woman who was machshel others, she deserves a really bitter punishment. But still, the etzem avera would be lebe malkus v'lebe chatos, because it's only technically, ultimately, an isser d'Rabbanan. So that's his, how he acknowledges, to whatever extent, he acknowledges the etzem shaila. Almost doesn't discuss it. Everyone's taking it for granted that she's a marshas and this is terrible. And this tshuva is actually quoted earlier in Pischei Tshuva, at the end of Siman Kuf Pei, he quotes the Chassam Sofer. People point out that the Chassam Sofer seems to be completely oblivious to the fact that there's at least a discussion about this, a shiltiki beirim, this, that. It's like it's taken for granted that this crazy woman came up with this crazy idea. So before we continue, I just want to make 2 points. First of all, it's interesting to note that all the Makairas seem to be discussing women. Women did it, women said, women decided. The Rav doesn't seem to be in the picture. Today, if we were asking the same question, the question would have been, can the Rav spit on it? What if the Rav spits on it? So I suspect this might have to do with the history b'chlal of bringing maros to a Rav. The idea that you're constantly bringing maros ksamim to the mutz to check, which to my understanding is actually a fairly recent development, the last 150 years or so. And it seems like until then, lav dafka was that common to bring a mara to a Rav. I've already mentioned this to some in conversation. That's it's really its own topic, and I do want the Mirz Hashem to focus on that more directly in a different share. So it could be that's why we're seeing that in all these discussions, it always seems to be the women's territory. And maybe the Paskim's attitude also has something to do with that. These women are coming up with these ideas, where's this coming from? It's not like a motz who was makabel from the person who gave him shimush, etc. Now it would seem though, today with motzim, that those who have a Messiah of Maris, that there are some scenarios in which spit might be used, might play a role. But it's very important to pay attention to the distinction between different situations. So for example, in Siman Kuf Beches, you have the opposite. When you have these small pieces, so the Shulchan Aruch talks about a test that if you try to melt them and it doesn't go, then tahira, that proves that it's not congealed blood. So some mention spit in this context. In fact, some point out that some Sefer himself, earlier in Siman Kuf Nun Tes, talks about a woman who has these kraten in her aids, and they tried doing the miyuch with the nail, and it didn't. He says, I don't even know what the question is. Pshita de tahiri. No one ever disagreed with that. Shekoshlein mayach bereik b'tzipayren tahira. So you see, he describes it as the nail and spit test. And he adds later, "U'maisim b'choyem b'veis midrashenu v'onu metarim ayidei b'dikas reik v'tzipayren v'chein kibalnu from my Rabbi Reb Nosson Adler, who was still alive at the time." So you see that it's a totally different type of test. So you have to make sure you're distinguishing. Huh? That's about. That's you see a lot of shuvas about kartan is a situation where a woman can't be tar. It's very different than bringing a regular kasem. Dafka, you find a lot of shuvas about kartan. That's usually a big problem.
They could do that same test themselves.
Huh?
They could do that test themselves.
It's only negayat to kartan. It's not negayat to regular ksamim. This is my whole point is that this is a different category than regular ksamim.
And we see from the Rabbi that always carried a coin with him that people used to ask him,
Right, okay. Fine. Also, relatively recently, and that's also about size. Not Abu said that that's about colors. From there we see that they checked size. It's hard that most people, for the fact that Alter Rebbe had to get a coin, so you see that in those days getting a size right was a very tall order. So you needed one person in town who has the coin. But it doesn't mean that they were doing all these other things. Okay, different discussion. You look in Mercedes Moshe by Rav Moshe Feinstein's grandson, who, at least according to, if he's to be believed, he kept the Yeman of the Psakim of Rav Moshe. He mentions a case where they brought a mara, it looked tameh, but it was also very thick, and Rav Moshe had a suspicion that it was actually some kind of pus from an infection. And he used spit to sort of break it open, and then he showed, on the bottom of the mara, it doesn't look like a mara. So you have to know specifically in what sense, in what context we're using spit. Another nakuda to mention is that, like I touched on before, people are asking, the Gemara says Zayin Samanim, we don't even use Zayin Samanim anymore, why are we suddenly relying on spit? But you have to pay attention. The Gemara, we're talking about a color that's stronger than blood. The blood itself was very hard to get out. You needed Zayin Samanim to get the blood out. People couldn't get blood stains out, generally. So when we're saying that the Zayin Samanim were forgotten, what that means is that even if the stain remains, how do I know that that's really tseva? Maybe it's really dumb. I just don't know how to get blood stains out of clothing anymore. So they both remain. Mash'enkein in these later Makaidas, at least the idea was the opposite, that there's true blood. The Gemara's assumption is true blood is difficult to remove. So if you're seeing that it's easy to remove, maybe the Gemara would be made 100% that's totally great bedika. No mashmos from the Gemara against that. But as far as I've seen, I did not find certainly any printed makar to use spit in a regular red kasem. Also, you go to Rabbanim, it's not something that they're generally doing. In normal cases of Ksamim, they're not spitting on everything. Unless, like we said, maybe there's a specific case, like the Ma'aser from Moshe, where they have a theory that it's something totally different, then maybe spitting on it could be part of that, depending on what I guess probably in part based on their Messiah. But certainly not Stamazai. Now the question is, what about the scientific tests that we have today? Can we, specifically, one question would be, can we use that to be mekel and to be a matara woman? And number two, does that mean now that in cases where I might have been mekel, now I can't be mekel anymore? Let's go test it first. Why are we being mekel anymore? So what kind of tests are there? So for example, and this is of course touches a lot on forensic testing, crimes. You're trying to ascertain at the scene of a crime what's going on here. So this has, of course, been very important for the last 100 years or more. as the understanding of chemistry has developed. So there's a general test that's used to distinguish between blood, without getting into what kind of blood. Blood generally versus not blood. So for example, you look it up, there's something basic called the Castle-Mayer test. There's also something called the leukomalachite green test. And the idea generally is that the hemoglobin in the blood has a certain interaction with other chemicals. So depending on which chemicals you placed, so it will turn this color, it will turn that color, but the interaction causes a color change if there's blood there. If there's no blood, the color doesn't change. In this context, there are also those who mention there's the possibility of checking under a microscope. Surely blood looks different under a microscope than other stuff. You can also do a DNA test. Potentially, is this human matter or is this synthetic? So I saw, for example, someone by the name of Rabbi Netanel Wiederblank. He wrote in the Kaivis Beis Yitzchak of the Yeshiva in YU, in the name of his Rabbi Mordechai Willig. Rabbi Willig says you could rely on these types of tests. He mentions the leukomalachite test to be makel. But of course, it's only helpful in a case where your question is this blood or is this something else entirely? Because at least this type of test doesn't distinguish between types of blood themselves. And in Ha'ara, he mentions that he heard B'Shem, Rabbi Yasha Ber Soloveitchik of YU, who said you should not rely on these types of tests. That's the shmua that they say, but it's not accompanied by any reason, by any rationale. Because one of my Rabbeim there, I guess in the yeshiva there, said that it's l'shitosoi of Rabbi Soloveitchik, because Rabbi Soloveitchik famously said that we can't allow shinuyim in halacha. If tavla mesav tandu, it's his famous vart, that you can't say that women today feel differently about whether they want to stay in a marriage. You have to say that it's a metaphysical truth, it can never change, so it's fitting that Rabbi Soloveitchik would also be opposed to any sort of intervention by science in this way. If you look in Shut Tzitz Eliezer, Chelik Yud Gimel Simon Pei Aleph, so already back in Tov Shalom Lamed Vav, he was asked by Dr. Avram Steinberg, who's the author of many works on the Torah and medicine, the Encyclopedia Halachtis Refuit. So one of the questions there was, he says, first of all, can we make some kind of graph? Maybe every Rav should have a color chart. And when he gets a kasam, he can compare it to the color chart, and he'll know that only this range of colors on the chart are tameh. And the second question was, can we use some kind of chemical process? And through the through the reaction, we can see the color will change, and that can tell us if there's blood or not. This can help us prove in Bechlal Meduber B'dam Eloi. So Tzitz Eliezer says, in my opinion, we have to reject these suggestions. Because according to halacha, we can't rely when it comes to the Sug Hadam or the Mare Hadam, we can't rely on doctors. And he says, go look at the Tanoim, the Amiroim, they knew everything. And they were able to distinguish between types of blood, the Chamisha Damim or not. And you see that they already stopped. They said, I don't want to be Mavchim Ben Dam L'Dam. And he says, look in the Tur, who after he says that like kol dam habam and hamakar tamei, not all blood, even from the makar is tamei, only the 5 types, but he keeps on adding, he keeps on emphasizing that shema yavayu litis b'yisrakadas hichmidu l'tamei l'kol maradam adoim, again in Simkuf Peches. And this is the halacha and all the Sifrei HaPaiskim, no one disagrees that if there's a marad adam, you're matame. And all the discussions are whether it's coming from the rechem or whether it's coming from somewhere else. But that's his reaction to this suggestion. So, in kol hakavod, ein kol makom la'atzas kvoidei. Itay aslicha. If you look, though, in Dr. Steinberg's work, Encyclopedia Halachtis Refuit, Chelik Hey, you see that he does quote the response of Rav Shlomo Zalman, but it's yesh oimrim v'yesh oimrim. What's the other yesh oimrim that he found? The Nishmas Avram is another author who also writes a lot on halacha and medicine. So Nishmas Avram on Siman Kuf Tzaddik, he writes to the question of whether we can use kadurim or niyaris miyuchadim, which can be used to test whether there's blood in something or not, assuming that it's a reliable test. I am B'Shut Tzitz Eliezer not to rely on it. But my Rabbi Neuwirth, the author of Shmei Shabbos Kol Chasa, the big Talmud of Shlomo Zalman, my Rabbi Neuwirth told me that if the Meirei Ra has a suffix, he already has a basis he has a concern. For example, a woman is using red nail polish, and then she did a bedika. Very smart. So, okay, but now I'm suspecting that I have a much better explanation for what's going on here. Or she was using, she did a bedika, but it was with a cloth that had gone through the wash. Yeah?
Bedika and Kesef was two different things too.
Okay.
I'm just saying, it's inflating this.
Okay, but he brings it here in Siman Kuf Tzadik, on this inyan. So she did a bedika with a cloth that went through the wash, and now it might have a bit of a rusty, some rust that got onto it. So then you can use these tests, bein lahachmer, bein lahakol, v'akavana gam legabe bedikas nidus. So it sounds like he's saying that whenever you have these types of shilas, you can rely on them. And he says, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Shlita also told me, she'ein lanu ela masha kavei ha'meirah ha'irah lefido eis einov. But if there's a suffix, v'yesh b'melitlis, so then you can also use the test to support that. V'kol shekein b'ksamim hanimtzayim al gufa ayal b'gadel b'mei taharasa. Some are even more lekula. We're talking about b'dikas, so for sure, some. Also, that's pro. At least when there's a bit of an explanation. What?
Everything you were mentioning was only about Ksumim.
Yeah. So he started off by saying b'dikas v'kol shekein ksamim. Fine. Okay. You have to keep in. Yeah. In the negative column, the Chivas Van Haggis, Rabbi Sternbach, Chelik Hey, Siman Rish Samachvav, he's talking about that somewhere here, when there's a woman who has a shayla, if she has a makkah, they say to put a finger with alcohol, and if you feel pain, that proves that there's some kind of wound, there's some kind of bruise. He says, Hadavar Tamua, Pirtza Gedoyla, Yishtaka Hadavar. Doesn't prove anything. Maybe the skin is just sensitive, that's why it hurts. And he says, when I was in South Africa, Rabbi Sternbach says, the doctors brought some machine to me, and by touching it, you can see if it's blood or not. And they use it for medical research. And they suggested that they brought it to the Rabbanim as a proposal. He says, Aniyas Nagalati, I opposed, because maybe Chazal were mataken, Shirak Hashem is butter, Iyas Chacham, She'eni Dam, Moyo. Maybe you need that Iyas Chacham to be matin. And anyway, who knows what their definition of blood is? Can't really trust them. Chadash Asr Me'atayra, throws that in. Now today we even have, at this point we have even more advanced medical tests that can distinguish between different types of blood. One sefer mentions that you can test for hormones. We know when a woman is menstruating, there are certain hormones that are active. So perhaps you could make a test to look for those hormones to see if they're present. Although he himself points out that wouldn't be so helpful because sometimes ksamim happen, dafka, when she's not menstruating, and al pitayra it's still a problem, so the lack of hormones wouldn't really help you necessarily in that situation. Rabbi Shulchan mentioned there's a new test, a new forensic test. If a woman is claiming that she's bloodied by someone committing a crime, and the question is that in fact blood from bruising, or is that maybe just menstrual blood, and maybe the whole story is not true? So there is now a forensic test to be able to test between what they call peripheral blood, normal blood, and menstrual blood, and they test for that by looking for the presence of D-dimers, that's the term. But in conclusion, it seems that almost, as far as we can tell, it's almost not been accepted lamaisa, either because some hold, the mamash hold like we saw, that we shouldn't be mixing science into halacha, because who knows what's going to be next. Maybe soon we'll start asking about kashrus and blias, maybe that will be the next thing people want to suggest. Or because it's not really helpful or necessary, we're doing fine as it is, we don't need to mix science into it. Maybe if there's a unique situation where there's more of a need, maybe they will rely on it. But there's certainly no chiyuv. One thing is for sure, there's no chiyuv to check in this way. And as those who talk about the whole gather of chisar and yediyah, do we have the ability to know? Do we not have the ability to know? They will have those who are a little bit makel. There's some people who are makel a little bit based on this idea that we taka don't know. Rav Moshe in Chelik Ches, which is the more iffy Chelik of Igros Moshe, but there is a quote there where he says that in the time of Lavush, they still thought maybe they'll find someone who knows the Zayin Salman. But today we know for sure it's been hundreds of years. We have the whole world mapped out. No one knows the Zayin Salman. Maybe we could be more makel. So if you go with that, what about now? Now we have tests. So now does that change the halacha? There's some who taka say that did change the halacha in that way, but there's some who. I don't know if, some who want to say maybe not. The Rav doesn't have the tests handy. He's not mechuyev to have the tests. But certainly to the question of should we start being machmer from now on, should we stop going to the Rav, and should we just go do tests, surely we know Chazal told us how things work, that's not changing anytime soon. And in fact, you have the Shiur Shevet HaLevi earlier in Siman Kuf Tzadik Sif Chav Gimel, he writes, V'yayim avshaluv de kesem b'microscope, levar b'vadim utzav v'aydam nidus, v'ibadika toiva yoyser, me'ha avaras zayin samanim, u'mikol makim, not chayiv to go and check. So, it's hard to explain why these tests should be worthless, but again, either there's a shtickle pirza, we don't want science encroaching on Torah, or even if we accept the possibility, but we don't see the purpose, we don't see the needs to go in that direction. So Maskana, more or less, broadly speaking, we do not rely on these tests.
How could somebody say that?